My name is Frank Sisson. I'm from the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and I'm on the executive committee of the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, popularly known as HREC. The consortium is a part of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies of the University of Alberta. That is one of the sponsors of this event. The others are the International Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, a division of the Zorian Institute, the Canadian Foundation for Ukrainian Studies, the Petro Yatsyk program at the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies of the Monk at the University of Toronto, and the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures of the University of Toronto. And I then was just informed that the chair of Ukrainian Studies would like to be a sponsor as well from the History and Political Science Department, so we will add them to our list. So I've gotten through with all of our sponsors, to all of whom we are very grateful for organizing, I think, which will be a very interesting comparative day, a discussion of starvation as a political tool from the 19th to the 20th century, the Irish famine, the Armenian genocide, the Ukrainian Holodomor, and genocide by attrition in the Nuba Mountains of Sudan. And we thank you for coming. All of you have a packet. You will see this rather, I think, good poster, elegant poster. And on the back you have the conference program for the day. So please look at that program. In our proceedings today, we will have 2 talks in each session of about 25 to 30 minutes. And then our discussant for both sessions will have about 15 to 20 minutes. We have hopes that we will have enough time for a good discussion, and we can run a little bit over in each session. There is flexibility. And then at the end of the day, there will be a discussion of a very interesting oral history project on the Holodomor. And we are pleased to have an eminent list of speakers for this event. The HREC has tried in its first 3 years of existence to draw as many people as possible from various disciplines into discussions of the Holodomor, or famine genocide of 1932-33 in Ukraine. And that goal has been to benefit by the results of other studies, to look at various aspects of the Holodomor in comparative perspective, and as well to learn from other fields and other areas in which various genocides and famines have been studied. Our first conference was on contextualizing the Holodomor, and it was an attempt to discuss how 30 years in which there have been really quite intense study of this tragedy and atrocity in North America as well as in Ukraine, what this has meant for the study of a number of fields, such as genocide studies, Soviet history, Ukrainian history, the history of communism. That conference is available online on our website, but we have now published the proceedings contextualizing the Holodomor, and I urge you who would like a copy to get it. They are in the back, as well as other books from our institute and from the Zorian Institute. The second conference we held last year was on communism and famines, and it was a comparative discussion of the Chinese famine, in which up 45 to 50 million people died, the Kazakh of the late 1950s and early 60s, the Kazakh famine, which took about a quarter of the entire Kazakh population in 1931-32, and the Ukrainian Holodomor. It was to us very interesting because we often feel that the Holodomor has not been intensively studied as it should have been, largely because the Soviet Union denied it had ever existed, and one could not carry on study in Ukraine until the late 1980s and the early 1990s. What we found, I think, that was very interesting for us was how little has been done on the Chinese famine. That is this tremendous loss of life. And although we have problems with sources of the Ukrainian famine now that this is over 80 years ago, we also found out that there is almost no eyewitness testimony available of the Kazakh famine. That is, we must reconstruct it almost entirely on the Soviet sources of that period of official organs, and realize that, relatively speaking, there is a greater abundance and diversity of material on the Ukrainian famine. Today we will be discussing starvation in events that go not only into the 20th century but back into the 19th century, and bringing it up to the very present. And I think it's a very interesting endeavor that we are all involved in. So I greet you here, and I would like to ask George Sherinian of the International Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies to say a few words. George.
Thank you, Frank. I was delighted when I was contacted by Marta Bazouk earlier this year with the idea of doing a small local, I won't use the word conference, maybe symposium about Holodomor and the Armenian genocide. Our relationship with the Holodomor Research Center goes back to the early 1990s when Frank and my brother Lauren actually did a small two-person lecture on Ukrainian genocide, Armenian genocide back then. Then Frank was with us in Yerevan in 1995 at a very large international conference on the problems of genocide. And then last year, I think at St. Vlad's, we did a talk together on rescuers in genocide. And then when they approached me with the idea of doing another small local event on the Armenian and Ukrainian, I said, why don't we take the opportunity to open it up and make it more comparative? So we put our heads together and added a couple of other important large case studies that really, I think, enriches our understanding of the nature of starvation and genocide, and really highlights the kind of synergy when groups like the HREC and Zorian put their heads together. I just want to take the opportunity to mention one of the many publications that my organization puts out that's relevant to today. We published the journal Genocide Studies International. And there's some flyers on the book desk. If you're interested in subscribing, please pick up a flyer. We also published a journal called Diaspora, a journal of transnational studies. There's also a flyer about that. And if you have any questions, please see me after or during the breaks. Thank you very much. Hope you have a great conference.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Doris Bergen, the Chancellor Rose and Ray Wolf Professor of Holocaust Studies here at the University of Toronto. And it's really my pleasure to moderate this morning's session. And it's a special pleasure for two reasons, really. One is because of the topic of this symposium, starvation as a political tool. As someone who studies genocide, mass violence, mass destruction of human lives, I'm well aware that starvation is one of the most potent tools of destruction of human lives and communities. But it's nonetheless often neglected or misunderstood or just left out of the picture. So I think it's really important and excellent that this topic, starvation as a political tool, has been made the center of our attention for today. Another thing that's really special about today's program, which has already been touched on by George Sherinian, is the range of different particular cases that will be investigated. The Holodomor, the Armenian genocide, the Nuba Mountains in Darfur, Stalin, and starvation as a tool to tame the peasantry. And no matter what your own areas of expertise on, I think you could add several more cases to that list yourselves. Finally, something that makes it a special pleasure for me to moderate the session is the cast of speakers today, and specifically on our panel this morning. These three speakers are very well known to me, each in different ways, and I think that you will find that they bring with them a wealth, I would say a world of knowledge and experience, and really a tremendous array of kinds of expertise in the study of this field. So I'm going to introduce them all at the beginning. Maybe it's more efficient, I don't know. And maybe you'll see how they connect and what they each bring. So our first speaker, Professor Mark McGowan is my colleague in the Department of History here at the University of Toronto. He's also no stranger to this institution because for almost a decade he was the principal here of St. Michael's College. Professor McGowan is an expert in the religious, social, migration, and educational history of Canada and Ireland. He has published many books and articles. I'm just going to mention one recent title, his 2009 book, Death or Canada, The Irish Famine Migration to Toronto in 1847. In addition to his many publications, Professor McGowan has also received 4 university teaching awards, and I think you'll be the beneficiary of that particular aspect of his talents this morning. He's currently the Senior Academic Advisor to the Dean International, and he's going to speak on rethinking the famine plot, the case of the Great Irish Famine, 1845 to 1851. Our second speaker, you've already heard from, will be George Sherinian, Executive Director of the International Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, a division of the Zorian Institute, and based here in Toronto. Mr. Sherinian, too, has published many articles, edited volumes. As you may have noticed, he's associated with the journal Genocide Studies International. But I know him in particular for the role that he has played, really an important role, as he writes modestly, one of the organizers, but I would say really the heart of the annual Genocide and Human Rights University program, a 2-week seminar that runs here at the University of Toronto every year. Some of you have been involved in this seminar, and those of us who have know that it's really a transformative, an important event that I think personally has done an enormous amount to raise international awareness of the importance of genocide studies and the sort of crucial cooperations among people with different kinds of stakes in that subject. So Mr. Sherinian will speak to us today on forced starvation in the Armenian genocide. Our discussant today, Professor Joyce Apsel, is Master Teacher of Humanities in the Liberal Studies program of the College of Arts and Sciences at New York University. Professor Apsel, too, has written many articles, edited and co-edited very important volumes. Again, I'll just mention a recent title. She co-edited with Ernesto Verdaya, Genocide Matters, Ongoing Issues and Emerging Perspectives in 2013. And she too is an award-winning teacher, has been a visiting professor at important institutions in the United States and in Europe. And Professor Apsel too is deeply connected with the Genocide and Human Rights University program. She's been course director for several years. And in this role, and in her role as president of the Institute for the Study of Genocide, former president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, she is really a world leader in this field and someone who has trained generations of scholars and activists in genocide studies. So we look forward to hearing from all 3 of our speakers, and I'll ask Professor McGowan to begin. Thank you.
Thank you. You haven't heard me yet, though. The topic, and I have a lot of nervous energy, so I'm actually going to, I'm not going to read. I'm actually just going to talk you through some things. It's early in the morning, and there could be no worse torture than a historian this early in the morning reading to you. So I've elected not to do that. This topic that I'm going to be addressing, which is the famine plot, is one of the most contentious topics in Irish historiography today and among the Irish in the diaspora. And I wanted to give you a flavor right off of 3 positions that are taken and where essentially historians and non-historians camp on this. So the first is by Tim Pat Coogan. This book was published in 2013, The Famine Plot. Just to give you a sense of where Tim Pat is coming on the whole nature of genocide and the famine, he says, John Mitchell's stark analysis that God sent the blight, but the English created the famine rings true. Whig policy was directed at getting peasants off the land, and if it took mass death to achieve that directive, so be it. He waits till the end of the book, really, to reveal his hand. He says shortly thereafter, certainly the years 1846 to 51, responsible Whig decision-makers were complicit in genocide and did direct public incitement, as the columns of the Times sadly confirm, only too well towards furthering that end. So that's 2013. That's relatively close. This is a hot topic. This was a best-selling book in Ireland, hotly debated on the radio with one of the other people who have positioned themselves on this debate, and recently debated in Newry during the National Famine Commemoration, for the first time held in Northern Ireland, but this debate over the genocide was one of the feature events prior to the commemoration. Another recent book, this by Kieran O'Murchada, The Great Famine, Ireland's Ireland's Agony, 2011, he says, if genocide is to be taken to signify deliberate, systematic annihilation of an entire ethnic group by mass murder, there is no 19th century equivalent that applies anywhere. However, if it is defined as a deliberate, systematic use of an environmental catastrophe to destroy a people under the pretext of engineering social reform, then there is a case to be answered. He now moves away from Tim Patt's more definitive position and places himself in an area where debate is possible. The final quotation that I think is relevant this morning is from Liam Kennedy, and this is coming from a book that is soon to be published in November called Unhappy the Land, and he says, contrary to what might be surmised, modern Irish society is not particularly receptive to the doctrine of genocide. The fact that virtually all historians of Ireland have reached a verdict that eschews this position, be they Irish-born scholars from Britain, North America, or Australasia, has weakened the traditional populist position. That's Liam Kennedy. And it was actually Liam Kennedy and Tim Pat Coogan going toe-to-toe in a debate that was far more interesting than anything we saw during the last federal election campaign here. One of my colleagues who was actually there sometimes described it as a dialogue of the deaf, but nonetheless, both Liam Kennedy and Tim Pat Coogan represent positions on the Irish famine as genocide that are worth looking at and examining through the historical evidence that's presented. And so in the next 20 minutes, what I'd like to do is go through the historical evidence and see where the evidence places the question of, was the Irish famine a genocide as defined by these individuals? So let's take a look. For many of you who are not familiar with the Great Famine, I'm going to give you, sadly, a very quick overview of some of the major events. Pittophora infestans and strikes, as opposed to stikes, was a fungal infection of potato stalks that actually struck in North America prior to Ireland and Europe in the early 1840s. In fact, it had less of an impact here in destroying the potato crop than, let's say, in Ireland, only because crops were diversified here in North America, in the St. Lawrence Valley, in Pennsylvania, in upper New York State, and in Cape Breton Island. In fact, the only place where there was a recorded famine prior to the Irish famine because of Pittophora infestans, or PI, was Cape Breton. And there, the Cape Bretoners in the Margaree Valley, and certainly in the interior of that part of Canada, were highly dependent on the potato for many of the same reasons the Irish were. Okay? Ireland's cottiers and small farmers were dependent on the potato monoculture because of a long-standing problem in the land system, and that is a huge tenantry that was subject to a landlord class that owned the land, oftentimes was absentee, and the land was continually subdivided. With large families in the 19th century, it meant that large plots of, let's say, 20 acres of land within a generation would become many plots of 8, 6. If you fly over Ireland today, you can see the variegations in the landscape that still date from this period as small plots of land, which of course did not afford the smallest farmers from producing anything more that would essentially sustain their families. The potato was a highly nutritious, rich, plentiful crop that could be grown on a very small piece of land and yield an amazing yield seasonally. In fact, it's said that with the potato as it stood in the 19th century, about 14 pounds of potatoes were consumed by an average Irish male farmer per day. And that's hard to realize. When you go to famine commemorations in museums in Ireland and they have a sack there on the floor that's 14 pounds and you lift it up, you realize that was consumed in a day. Highly nutritious but very important monoculture for the Irish people. The crops had been damaged in 1817 and 1821, and so when in 1845, here's a map of Ireland to give you a sense, divided into 32 counties. In 1845, when both the spores came from North America on board cargo ships and from Europe, where it was already affecting a European population, the attack on the crop in the fall affected about 17 out of these 32 counties. It was not quite as devastating as what would come, okay? It partially destroyed the crop. Many of the people saw this as just part of the pattern. We had already suffered through this. Next year will be better. There was a concern about seed potatoes because, of course, you must keep part of that crop back so that you can seed next year's crop. So there was some concern, particularly among the poorest farmers who had the most to lose because they had the least in terms of land. And of course, their yield was to be divided accordingly between what they could consume and what they could plant for the next year. Now, the government at the time was the government of Sir Robert Peel. He had extensive experience in Ireland prior to becoming Prime Minister. He wasn't necessarily one of the most popular Prime Ministers in Ireland, and there's a whole backstory there. What he did was actually quietly, from the Baring brothers, spend about 100,000 pounds to import maize. That is what we would call corn, but called maize or Indian corn from the Americas to be ground and to be sold for 1 pence per pound in order to help those who were in most need because of the partial failure of the crop in 1845. By 1846, they had repealed the protection that farmers had on cheap grain imports. This was a long-standing issue in England, whether the tariffs on grain should be maintained to protect British farmers. Peel, who had long time had free trade sympathies, finally split his party, lost power, but was able to drop the tariffs that would prevent cheap grains from being imported with, partly the Irish famine in mind. And there's a very complicated backstory to that as well. The government falls, and we'll be familiar with this. The government fell, but not due to election, but because Peel had lost confidence of the House. And it's really important for our story of the famine to look at this particular government, and that was the Whig government or the Liberal government of Sir John Russell. Lord John Russell is sitting there. He assumes power because he can control the House and many of the free traders within Peel's own party. Okay? Previously, he had the support of Daniel O'Connell, the great Irish liberator. So this is a prime minister who is interested in Ireland. He certainly saw having O'Connell's support as advantageous within his own political career. But his party adhered to a rather rigid and doctrinaire political economy based in laissez-faire capitalism. And that is a belief, okay, that the market should be left unfettered, the government should not interfere, and allow the natural forces of the marketplace to do their work. Now, this is not strange to us. Those of us who lived in Ontario in the 1990s heard this same type of mantra. We've also heard it quite recently at the federal level. So the Whig position, okay, would influence the way in which Ireland certainly would be treated when the next tragedy hit. The policy was to be delivered essentially by this individual who routinely at famine conferences is put on trial for genocide. Professor Wilson is here today. He and I have attended many of these things as Charles Edward Trevelyan, who was Secretary of the Treasury, was responsible for implementing policies regarding the flow of money and the protection of the free market. He was a doctrinaire free trader. He believed that no food exports from Ireland should cease during this period lest the market forces be disrupted. Okay? He was reluctant to have a population dependent on the government. Okay? So if the government interfered and gave the Irish people a handout, that would interfere with the natural forces of the market. It also would create an unnatural dependency of the Irish people on the pocket of the government. Okay? He was also a providentialist, so we're going to add another layer to it. Okay? He believed in the hand of God as an evangelical Anglican, in having, how should we say, presence on earth, and that natural events could be interpreted as being inspired by divine will. And I think this is important to Park, okay? Because he's not alone in these providentialist beliefs. All right. So catastrophe strikes complete crop failure in most of the 32 counties in 1846. Compounded with that is one of the fiercest winters in Irish history over 1846, 1847. And despite the fact now that the food supply, which had been maintained by these cheap imports under Sir Robert Peel, the government now faces a massive catastrophe that was not faced a year before. So the government, though, maintains this rigid doctrinaire policy of laissez-faire in the belief that, okay, the government that interferes least is giving the most benefit to the economy in the long term. Now, oftentimes, arguments on the famine and genocide tend to rest here, okay? What I'd like to do is unpack for you some of the other forces that are working within Irish society and really outlining my position of there is lots of blame to share, okay? That we oftentimes rest at the feet, the failure to Edward Trevelyan. So, mass starvation. The principal source of food is gone. There's a lack of funds to buy food in Ireland. This means if there's a lack of funds to buy food, there's a lack of funds to pay rents by these tenants to their landlords, and now they face eviction, okay? And that means internal migration on the highways and byways of Ireland. Those who could sell what they had or who had relatives in North America could look at emigration, but in the long term, people died. Okay? Now, there were remedial actions by the Whig government. There were several, and I cluster them into three areas. First of all, there were public works. I have that in the middle. Roads, ditches, a system that actually was made for a heavy investment by the British government, about £4.1 million at the time. So the British government is active, but in ways, for example, okay, public works, that would make the Irish peasantry responsible for uplifting themselves without disrupting the economy. In fact, by putting money in their hands through public works, they then would be able to buy food, which then would be able to stave off starvation. And interestingly enough, Nobel laureate Amartya Sen argues pretty much the same thing in his book Development as Freedom. So it's interesting that this particular policy has legs well into the past in the United Kingdom. The second thing, when these public work systems, this is actually a famine wall in the town of Cashel. So many of these projects were abject failures. Roads to nowhere, roads that started across bogs that essentially were dropped. In fact, the government knew within about 3 months that these public works programs were futile, and they began to shut them down. Shortly thereafter, they developed a new policy, and that was immediate outdoor assistance through soup kitchens. And in a sense, this was not new because private interests had already undertaken selling and giving soup. Churches, for example, the Society of Friends, the Quakers, were already active in famine relief on the ground. The government introduced a massive program. In fact, they even had a special chef come over and create a recipe. And there's great debate about whether or not that was nutritious enough to sustain the people. Nonetheless, this was a program that was working, feeding millions every day in dire straits. Then there were the poor law unions. They had been thrust upon Ireland in 1838. There were 130 of them. There had been, of course, a commission to look into Irish poverty in the 1830s. It had actually argued against a British-style poor law system. They needed something that was more essentially that could mesh with this unusual tenant-landlord system that was evident in Ireland. But they did a quick and easy, I'm really skimming over this, and in 1838 they established poor law unions, essentially with a workhouse that would be sustained by local donation and local committees subject to a committee in Dublin that would supervise all 130. You're seeing the Bauhaus, the ruins of the Bauhaus workhouse in Carsaveen, County Kerry. This is an unusual design because it actually had been an estate house owned by the McCarthy family that was converted into a poor house at the time. No outdoor relief was possible under the poor law. That all had to be within the workhouse or the workhouse compound, and thousands overwhelm a system that certainly wasn't designed for the numbers that were faced in 1846, 1847. So the government is doing something. They have 3 programs, not terribly creative, not terribly imaginative, but they have 3 programs. Okay, what is the human cost? The crop failures continue in 1848 and 49, and in fact the government thought they were off the hook by 1847 because there was a partial restoration of the crop, but not enough to undo the damage that had been done. They had scaled back programs thinking the famine was over, but by the end of it in 1851, 1 million people had died, okay, and 1.5 million had emigrated to British North America, to the United States, and to Australasia. And that's the famine in a nutshell. So let's take a look. The historiography was late in developing, okay? In fact, Edmond de Valera commissioned a study of the famine, hopefully coming out during the centennial in 1945. It took them over 10 years to get this book off the ground. The authors, Dudley Edwards and Desmond Williams, both very well-established historians, couldn't get along with one another, fought. Others began writing this book. They lost the footnotes in a cab, probably in a drunken stupor. This was not a very auspicious beginning for famine studies, but anyone who does famine studies has to go back to this source. The real popular book, published in 1962, was Cecil Woodham Smith's The Great Hunger. We were even talking about it this morning. But that particular book now becomes a popular bestseller and is reprinted and reprinted and reprinted, and then becomes the foundation for a genocidal thesis, even though she doesn't purport that the famine was a genocide, but she lays the cast of characters, their misdeeds, their lack of imagination, their lack of creativity, and the failure of government programs. And those foundations allow others, and subsequently Tim Pat Coogan, to make the claims that he makes, okay? There's a series of revisionists that appear in the 1980s and the 1990s who challenge Smith, who challenge the more popular and nationalistic interpretations of the famine, many of whom use genocide as a word within their work, within their speeches. And then there's a post-revisionist period where people begin to revise the revisionists, say, no, they went too far. And so it's an interesting historical debate in Ireland, fueled by, on the one hand, popular notions of the famine, with a foundation in what is a very good read. Cecil Woodham Smith's book is a very good read and still is used, versus those who now who are looking at the famine through a contemporary historical methodology, social historical method, new political history, and the like. I mean, I could go on and on about the various authors, but I don't want to bore you too much on this. So the populist versions are fueled in the 1990s, and I think it's important to note by, of course, the commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the famine. And in the 1990s, famine memorials begin to pop up all over Ireland. Okay? This is one in Ennistimon, County Clare, of a young boy knocking on the door of the workhouse, which was located on that site but torn down in the 20th century, looking for food because he's now an orphan. Very emotive, as you can see, and this is only part of the monument. Many of them were very emotive monuments. Many in the United States became a fusion of the famine tragedy and the American dream. I wish I had a picture here of the Boston Monument with ragged people who have just got off of a ship, and then on another side of the square, modern Americans, well-dressed, marching forward with pride into the country that they had adopted and had uplifted them from this poverty. And that's very important because American expressions of collective ethnic solidarity among the Irish really help fuel the populist debate as they look for a touchstone moment in their history as immigrants to the United States that they can say, this is where we came from, this is how we built ourselves, and this is where we are now as a result. In fact, in the states of New York and New Jersey, a famine curriculum was written into the school curriculum. The New York, very moderate, the New Jersey, not so. And so now American voices help in this cacophony of voices debating what was the famine all about. Let's take a look now. Let's take a look. British government. Yes, they were slow to respond. Yes, they were hardened in their political economy of laissez-faire. Yes, their programs were minimalist. Okay? The Gregory Clause in 1847 was certainly cruel. Gregory had inserted a clause in the revision of the Poor Law that would allow only those with a quarter acre of land or less to seek relief, okay? Which meant that all others had to basically abandon their properties and go to relief at the local workhouse. That meant, of course, that landlords could then take those properties, consolidate them for animal husbandry, which allowed for greater profits to them. But we'll get to that in a second. A lack of imagination or creativity, I've showed you that. They canceled programs too early. But in the end, and this is often omitted from populist histories of the famine, the British government did expend £9.5 million. Now, in today's Canadian dollars, that's $1.5 billion. So this was a massive expenditure, although still seen by contemporaries as potentially not enough. Landlords. Now, the impression of the landlords also fuels a populist debate. For example, they will evict tenants who cannot pay rent. Many of these landlords were already in debt, okay? Responsible for the poor law, they had to pay essentially to keep the poor law unions running. Many of them couldn't afford to do that. One of Trevelyan's mottos was, Irish property must pay for Irish poverty. And so much of the burden was saddled on them locally. They consolidated their holdings. Once they evicted tenants, they consolidated their holdings to maximize their profits in animal husbandry. So they were going to open up to herding. So if you're looking for starvation as a political and economic tool, you're going to find it here among the landlords because they are the ones who are now seizing this opportunity to essentially make profit where none had been or very little had been before. It was an economic opportunity. But landlords are far more complicated than what many historians will let you think. Now, there are the notorious here. Elizabeth Smith, I'll just read what she said. She was in County Wicklow. She said, "We are determined to rid the little tenants and to increase the large farms. As we did it, not at once, we watched for opportunities and managed this delicate business without annoying anyone, even causing a murmur. Envy, malice, evil-speaking, hatred, lying, and all uncharitableness, how I wish we did not have one tenant in Balterboys." Lord Lucan, George Bingham in Wicklow, he evicted 2,000 tenants, destroyed their homes so they wouldn't come back. He became one of the most notorious of the landlords, often quoted. William Gregory and his clause also I just mentioned. Lord Palmerston in Sligo and Kerry, he managed to evict tenants near Kenmare and sent them on ships to New York City. And you may be more familiar with this outcome of the famine because Martin Scorsese makes a movie about the 5 Points called The Gangs of New York, and the Irish there were likely from Lord Palmerston's estates in Kerry. Lord Lansdowne's estates. Palmerston had others. John Plunkett Jolly is a mystery because he actually keeps a diary during the famine, but he ignores the famine entirely. He mentions a couple of dead bodies on his estate in Kings County, now County Offaly, but for the most part, he's completely oblivious to what's going on all around him. In fact, his diary, parts of it have been recently published by Maynooth University, and they're brilliant for sketches of the local peasantry, dancing, making music, drinking heartily. You wouldn't know that he actually was in the midst of one of Ireland's great catastrophes in the 19th century. But what's really curious are the others. Stephen de Vere of Limerick, who actually goes on board with his assisted immigrants to British North America and then complains to the British government about conditions on board ship. John Hamilton. Very few people know about John Hamilton. He had a huge estate near Donegal town. He inherited at the age of 21 and nearly bankrupted himself in trying to help the peasants during the famine. He was also one who was noted for being much loved by the tenants on his estate. Lord Farnham and Cavan, the Duke of Devonshire, Lady Sligo, Lord Dufferin, these are all landlords who behaved quite differently from the Lord Lukens and the Elizabeth Smiths. And then there's the great mystery, Major Dennis Mann, one of the foci of my own work. Mann held an estate in County Roscommon in Connacht in central Ireland. This is actually his estate house. He inherited this estate from his debt-ridden uncle, Morris Mann, the Baron Hartland. And Morris Mann, to be quite polite, was very eccentric. For example, he didn't like seeing gardeners and servants, and so he built tunnels all around his house so that they could go underground and not pass by the windows of his study where he would have to see them. But of course, he nearly bankrupted the estate, inherited by Dennis Mann, and in 1847, Mann decided that the best thing that he could possibly do was essentially assist 1,490 tenants from his estate, chartered 4 boats to Quebec, and about 26% of them died in passage. But for Dennis Mann, this was a decision that he made because he thought, actually, that this was going to be better than starving on his lands when he could afford to do very little for them. And there's a great debate in County Roscommon as to, was Mann one of the bad landlords or was he one of the good landlords? Well, he's assassinated in November 1847 after coming out of a meeting where he was trying to assist the peasantry again, but he was assassinated because of the belief that he was responsible for the death of hundreds of these migrants on board one of the ships called the Virginia. So I'll talk about that in a moment. Thirdly, there were more hands in the famine than just the government and the landlords. There were mercantile and commercial interests. Now, read this carefully. Roman Catholic and Protestant merchants refused to divert their foodstuffs to the local population. This was not just an act of the government trying to save, in their political economy terms, the Irish economy. This was local merchants who said, we cannot afford to release our foodstuffs locally. Okay? Mary Daly, an eminent historian, argues that the diverted food would not have solved the food crisis, but nonetheless, other historians argue that a little bit certainly would have gone a long way, at least in 1845. Merchants used the market actually to force prices up. So one of the tragedies of the public works system was even if someone working on the public works actually accumulated a little bit of capital, oftentimes it wasn't enough because the prices were jacked up by the Irish themselves. Okay? Farming interests. Large tenant farmers who were not necessarily dependent on the potato refused to divert their crops locally. And this was not a religious enclave. These farmers were large tenants, both Catholic and Protestant, who also knew that they had to make their rents, the annual gale. So in order to do that, they had to sell their crops for the best price, and so they refused to sell it in the local market, and of course we're feeding the merchants and the commercial interests that I've just mentioned. So again, local interests, Protestant and Catholic, working in a different way than you would expect. They would not sacrifice their own lifestyle for the poor all around them. The churches. Now indeed, the Catholic Church and the Church of Ireland were active ministers in relief work. I've gone through Archbishop Murray's papers in Dublin. He really created the hub of the dispersion of funds internationally to local areas to help stop the starvation. The priests helped to keep the law, but the bishops were actually divided in their support of the government. Some supported the move of Trevelyan and Lord John Russell, others did not. And what's interesting here is even Theobald Matthew, the temperance crusader, one of the most popular priests in Ireland at the time, commended Charles Trevelyan for the work that they were doing for the Irish people. Capital projects were maintained, though, in churches. Church building didn't stop during the famine. Church decoration didn't stop during the famine. Papal collections didn't stop during the famine. The Church of Ireland continued tithing during the famine. The Church of Ireland lifestyle continued during the famine. So, in fact, some clergy even discouraged immigration, including Archbishop McHale, one of the most powerful voices in Ireland, the Bishop of Tuam. So the churches are not entirely clean here either. Providence, okay? Oftentimes, historians and populists have made a great deal over this providentialism. And I think if you look at on the ground, what you have to do is tease out another myth of the famine. And that is somehow this was a Catholic thing. That the hand of God, okay, had cast its lot against poor, ignorant Irish Catholic peasant farmers who didn't know enough to grow something other than potatoes. And because of their papistic heresies, God was now meting out punishment. But the interesting thing is, often ignored, is that the Northern Irish Protestants also suffered during the famine. The work of McAnasney and Keneally is quite clear that places like Lurgan and Belfast, County Down, Antrim, all suffered during the famine. And many were Protestant. In fact, one of the few Protestant famine memorials in the world is right here in Toronto in St. James Cemetery, because 20% of the 38,000 who landed here as refugees from the famine in 1847 were Protestant. So the policies that were meted out by the British government were meted out to Ireland, Catholic or Protestant. In fact, even today, there's a thing called the Firm in Glasgow. 2 football teams, Glasgow Rangers for the Protestants, Glasgow Celtic for the Catholics. And one of the chants among the Protestant supporters of Rangers are, "The famine is over, why don't you go home?" And the thing is that they could be singing it about themselves, because Protestants were also affected. So providentialism does not necessarily work as an argument. In fact, at the end of the famine, Catholics themselves, as Emmett Larkin will argue, thought that the famine may have been God's judgment, and that helped propel them into a new type of ultramontane Catholicism that the Irish now have become quite famous for. So I'd like to, medical ignorance, they're great debates. There were doctors on site. There were doctors paid. But doctors did not have the epidemiological advances that we do today. And so they were powerless to fight against the diseases that came out of famine. Cholera, typhus, and typhoid. In fact, Archbishop Murray, who collected data, and I'm so happy he collected data. He collected data on 74,000 deaths in 1847, and 70% of them had died through disease. And absolutely, the doctors were there, but they were absolutely powerless to do anything about the diseases that were generally known as fever coming out of the famine. The coffin ships. Just briefly, oftentimes they appear in populist accounts. They're colorful. They make for good storytelling. But the thing is that the coffin ships themselves are not the norm. In fact, the myth comes out that the United States didn't receive any immigrants in 1847 because they closed their ports. They didn't. They received over 110,000 in 1847. It's just that their inspection and their fines for bringing poor, impoverished, and diseased people to their shore were far more rigorous than British North America. Stephen DeVere and others helped change that. The coffin ship was more a feature of the early famine. It was more a feature of those ships going to British North America. And even the ships that Dennis Mann set his people on were different. Those were the 4 ships. I'm coming to the end here. But just to give you, we counted all the heads. What ship you went on was really a lottery. Look at Dennis Mann's people. Indeed, horrible. 221 people died on board the Virginius. But that was the lottery. The 1,490 people show up in Liverpool and they're given tickets. The ones who got on the Virginius and the Naomi were the unlucky ones. The ones who got on Erin's Queen were the lucky ones. It was a lottery. Mischievous ship's captains, poor medical facilities or lack of medical attention on board ships, poor food, rough seas, bad conditions on board ships, raging typhus. These are the things that killed these poor people, but the thing was, it was a lottery. If you got that ticket on the Erin's Queen, you were fine. If you got that ticket on the John Munn, you had more of a chance of life. So the coffin ships is a very shaky argument upon which the populace can base some of their story. So conclusions. I think it's fairly clear that Raphael Lemkin's definitions of 1948 don't apply in Ireland, given the evidence. I think there are many culpable parties with regards to Ireland's suffering. Rigid politicians, greedy merchants, opportunistic landlords, conflicted churchmen, self-serving farmers, the list could go on. There is a sharing here of the blame for this prolonged agony that Ireland suffered. Third, the government was myopic and cruel by the standards of the day, largely because of its rigid faith in the natural ability of market forces to work their way out. And I think this is the elephant often in the room, is the inability of those who argue for genocide to tackle the question of political economy seriously. This is very uncomfortable in the United States because those who often are the most vociferous in promoting the genocide thesis of the famine would also be those lining up behind Donald Trump and company arguing for those natural market forces. You can't have it both ways. Thank you.
One of the experiences most identified with the Armenians during the period 1915 to 1923 was starvation. Throughout the United States and the British Commonwealth, newspapers reported on their extreme hunger, posters pleaded for public donations for their relief, and children were admonished to clean their plates while eating and to remember the starving Armenians. In this paper, I will give you a brief understanding of the Armenian genocide, a feeling for what it was like to be in the genocide, and provide a possible explanation why starvation was used as a tool of genocide. On June 28th, the First World War broke out in Europe. On July 21st, 1914, the Ottoman government declared a general mobilization, and all male subjects were conscripted into the armed forces. The Ottoman Empire formally entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, that is, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Imperial Germany. Initially, while Armenian and Greek males aged 21 to 44 were conscripted into the army and placed in regular units, younger and older males were organized into what were known as labor battalions. They did road work, carried heavy packs and so forth, and they were treated a little differently. They were not provided proper uniforms, shoes, helmets, and were not fed properly. The disastrous defeat of the Ottoman army by the Russians at the Battle of Sarikamish in December 1914 was a great shock to the Ottomans, who were proud of their military heritage. A scapegoat was needed for their failure, and the Young Turk leadership convinced themselves that the defeat could only have been caused by the treacherous minorities, especially the Armenians. Anti-Armenian persecutions were undertaken under the auspices of the War Ministry, causing an outright rebellion by the Armenians in Van in late April 1915. Deportations of Armenians had already begun in February, yet the Van uprising was given as one of the justifications for the subsequent deportations. Belying their later justification of the events, the Young Turk leadership took the decision on February 25, 1915, to disarm all the Armenians in the army and transfer them to the labor battalions. There they were underfed, worked to exhaustion, and prone to disease. Mistrusted, they were put under armed guard and watched constantly. The Armenian soldiers, disarmed, malnourished, physically exhausted, and unable to resist, were now murdered en masse by their fellow Ottoman soldiers. U.S. Ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau, described the situation as follows. In the early part of 1915, the Armenian soldiers in the Turkish army were reduced to a new status. Up to that time, most of them had been combatants, but now they were all stripped of their arms and transformed into workmen. Instead of serving their country as artillerymen and cavalrymen, these former soldiers would now discover that they had been transformed into road laborers and pack animals. Army supplies of all kinds were loaded on their backs, and, stumbling under the burdens and driven by the whips and bayonets of the Turks, they were forced to drag their weary bodies into the mountains of the Caucasus. They were given only scraps of food. If they fell sick, they were left where they had dropped, their Turkish oppressors perhaps stopping long enough to rob them of all their possessions, even of their clothes. On April 24, 1915, a process began whereby hundreds of political, religious, and intellectual leaders of the Armenian community were arrested and sent to prison. Most were executed, with Armenian males conscripted into the army and murdered, and the Armenian leadership done away with. What remained of the Armenian population were mostly defenseless women, children, and old men. Orders were given that these were to be relocated away from the war zones for the purposes of military security. In practice, however, Armenians from everywhere, even far from the war zones, were displaced. Sometimes the Armenians were given a few days' notice to prepare for the deportation, sometimes only a few hours. They were allowed to take what they could carry in wagons, on donkeys, or on their persons. Everything else was confiscated by the state with the false promise that a record would be kept and that the Armenians would be compensated later. No compensation was ever made. The deportation journeys lasted from 1 to 2 months. The food supplies the deportees were able to carry ran out quickly. The government rarely provided food, water, or shelter for the deportees. In a written statement to the post-World War I Commission of Inquiry, looking into crimes committed by the Young Turks, Vehip Pasha, the commander of the Ottoman Third Army, made clear that the purpose of the deportations was the destruction of the Armenian community. Quote, "The massacre and annihilation of the Armenians and their looting and pillaging by the killers were the result of a decision made by the Central Committee of the Committee of Union and Progress. These specific acts of violence, which were carried out in accordance with a comprehensive program and with a clear intent, were performed upon the instruction and urging and with the supervision and follow-up of government functionaries, who were the tools of, first, the Central Committee of the CUP and its plenipotentiaries, and second, the wishes and aspirations of the CUP itself, which had discarded all considerations of law and conscience." The Young Turks were concerned at the beginning to keep the killings secret. They told their German allies only that they were deporting the Armenians from the war zones for military security. A revealing secret telegram from Talat to the Valley of Aleppo, dated November 18, 1915, advised against attracting the attention of the consular and embassy officials of the United States, which had not yet entered the war at this time. Don't bring to their attention what was being done to the Armenians. Quote, "From the intervention of the embassy in Constantinople, upon the instructions of the American government, in certain localities, American consuls have secured information through secret means. Although in reply to their inquiries it has been stated that the deportation of the Armenian refugees is being conducted in safety and comfort, but because this has not been sufficiently convincing, take care that the expulsion from cities, towns, and central localities shall not create events that might attract attention. From the point of view of the present policy, it is necessary for foreigners in such localities to be convinced that the transfer of refugees is solely for the purpose of relocation. For that reason, it is necessary, for the time being, that deportees be afforded gentle treatment and the known methods be applied only in the most suitable places. We urgently advise you to arrest the informants and to hand them over to the military authorities for trial. Interior Minister Talat kept close track of the mortality figures of the Armenians, yet took no interest in preventing the killings and deaths. For example, local CUP functionaries were ordered to clear the roads of all the dead bodies and threatened severe punishment if this were not done. As part of the plan to cover up the killings, perhaps the deaths from starvation could be called an unintended consequence of deportation and provide plausible deniability for the Young Turk leadership. The gendarmes who guarded the deportee caravans took advantage of their charges hunger and thirst to extort money from them. For example, the second deportation convoy from Erzurum, which set out on June 18, 1915, was attacked and massacred on 3 separate occasions. Then, the survivors were subjected to body searches for anything of value that could be confiscated. Then, there was a 4th attack in which the gendarmes threw the sick and crippled into the Euphrates River and took away young women and children. At Kema, some 300 men were packed into a stable and left without food or water. They had to bribe their guards to open the door to let in a little air or give them water from the Euphrates, for which they paid by the glass. Another survivor in a different location wrote, "The gendarmes did not allow us to drink water," they said, the gendarmes said, "Give us either 1 gold coin or a virgin girl." Similarly, another described the following: "We walked for hours and days. We were treated cruelly. I can say after each 2 or 3 kilometers, some would die, either because of hard beating or robbery or because of daring to try to drink water. They, the Turks, would give water if they received money. Sometimes they would take the money and kill instead." For those who had money, it was possible to buy food during the deportation, but it was a difficult and risky proposition. One survivor described his experience as follows: "Every day and night, tens of Turkish merchants standing in front of the caravansary's gate or on the low walls hawked all manner of foods. But at what cost? With money in hand, you got in line like a beggar, with the soldier's permission to buy food. When your turn came and you told the merchant what you wanted, he took your money and gave you not exactly what you paid for, but what his conscience dictated. The thing was, you were never given change. Whatever money you had in your hand, you had to kiss it goodbye. And in return, you were given a few pieces of bread, a tomato, an onion, a bunch of grapes, maybe a watermelon. We had no money in small denominations. Gold was all we had. For this reason, we went hungry for 2 days. I tried once and my mother three times to hand gold to a boy selling bread. But rather than give us bread, he screamed at us, 'Give me the money and I'll give you the bread.' Who would believe that you had already paid him, and up front? If you didn't make a second payment at once or got lost in the shuffle, the soldier's fist was more than ready for action." Starvation was also used for other types of extortion than food. One type was forcing the Christian Armenians to convert to Islam. One account describes how Armenians, quote, "were tied to the tails of ox carts and exposed to hunger and rough weather until they accepted conversion to Islam or death." Another type of extortion was forcing Armenian girls who resisted rape to capitulate due to starvation. After repeated attacks and brutal robberies, plus the extortion of money for food and water, what money the Armenians had brought with them ran out quickly. When there was no money, sometimes the deportees were able to barter for food. One survivor explained, "We did not have clothes either. What we had, we'd exchange for bread." At Deir Zor, a woman cut off her hair to sell it for bread. When their food and money to buy food ran out, the deportees ate what they could scrounge from their surroundings. Grass was widely eaten as a substitute for human food, and there were different varieties. Sometimes it was boiled and eaten with salt, sometimes with a small amount of milk. One survivor recalled, quote, "My poor brother had suffered very much. He had been hungry. He had even eaten cotton seeds like a donkey. He had eaten so much grass that his belly was swollen." You see, while it's possible to eat grass as a human being, your body does not digest the nutrition from grass. So you can eat as much as you want and you'll still be hungry, and that's why those people had distended bellies. In some cases, the deportees had to forage for garbage. One recounted, quote, "We were hungry. From the garbage we took orange peels, lettuce leaves, and ate them." The deportees were in such a desperate situation that they had to eat and drink the most repugnant things. In one case we are told, quote, "The women were obliged to urinate in water jugs and drink it." One eyewitness stated, "I saw a woman ate the dried blood of a dead animal in the street." One survivor told of his experience in Raqqa. "Sometimes when it rained, a big puddle formed. The zaptias, armed guards, would let their horses drink the water, and then the horses would defecate and urinate before we had a chance to drink the water ourselves. An adolescent girl saw that I was looking at her when she picked up some feces to eat, but dropped it, shrugging her shoulders as if to say, 'What can I do?' Sadly, others ate the feces of the horses, and some even ate the feces of other people." Eyewitness and survivor accounts also tell of people picking corns of barley out of horse manure to eat, the eating of sick and dead animals, dogs, cats, donkeys, oxen, and of cannibalism. It was reported that hunger among the deportees arriving in Deir Zor was such that some of them sold their children for money to buy food and to give the children a better chance to survive in a Turkish or Arab home. Now, Gregory, I'd like to show some pictures now. They're strong pictures, and they can be upsetting to some people, and you may wish to avert your eyes. Show the first one. Leslie Davis was the American consul at Harput. Next. Armitage Wegner was a German sanitation officer who secretly took these pictures and smuggled them out of Turkey. Next. Dead children. One child has had his clothes stripped from him, and you see a crowd of well-dressed gentlemen walking away. Next. Some of these are very famous pictures. Next. 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 That's it. While most of the time the Armenians were left to their own devices to feed themselves, sometimes the government did provide food and water. The Armenians from the town of Furnuz, for example, during their forced march to Deir Zor, were given 150 grams of bulgur per head. This is about 150 grams of bulgur. A German official reported, however, the government states that it gives food to the deportees. The transport from Harput received bread only once in 3 months. German teachers in Aleppo reported, the government supplies to this hospital lentils or bulgur or black soldiers' bread. The weakened stomachs of these poor creatures who have been driven, often for weeks, even months through the heat without water, can no longer stand this kind of food, which would not even be remotely sufficient anyway. Dysentery, exhaustion, typhoid fever are the results. Conditions in the collection camp of Tel Abyad were described as follows. Most of those lying in the yard were reduced to skeletons, and even those outside do not look much better. It is said that the people get 316 grams of bread each day from the authorities, of course of the worst possible quality, sometimes even some meat, as claimed by the authorities. The condition of the people is such as to prove sufficiently that these supplies are delivered irregularly, to say the least. In November 1915, the groups of women deportees from Urfa arrived in the collection camps of Ras Al Ain and Tel Abyad. One of the German missionaries reported the following there. One woman who recognized me again begged me to rescue her children. The supervisor pushed her back and shouted to her, "No one is going to be rescued here. You've got to walk until you drop dead, and wherever you may happen to end, the dogs will eat you." Soldiers from Hama who were accompanying this group demanded that the supervisor arrange for some bread, as the women had already been on the move for 2 days. His answer was merely, "They can drop dead. They're not going to get anything to eat." Sometimes the local Muslim population tried to help the Armenians by giving them food and water, but were thwarted by the gendarmes. Quote, between Marash and Aintab, the Mohammedan population of the village wanted to distribute water and bread to a transport of about 100 families, but the soldiers accompanying the transport would not permit this. A report from Aleppo described the following. A short while ago, the Armenian emigrants coming from the interior were led through the town, and the inhabitants were strictly forbidden to refresh those dying of thirst in the heat with a drop of water. Eyewitnesses confirmed that an old woman who collapsed from exhaustion was forced to move along by a gendarme who kicked and whipped her. When a woman came out of a neighboring house with a glass of water, the gendarme knocked the glass out of her hand and attempted to mistreat the old woman again. She dragged herself past another few houses and died there. Despite this, it is strictly forbidden to give the people bread or even water. 2 men who attempted to do so in 2 different places received official letters threatening them with court-martial. Another illustration of the intent to use food as a method of disposing of the Armenians is found in a secret telegram sent by Interior Minister Talat to the governor of Aleppo, dated December 12, 1915. Talat wrote, quote, "Gather and feed only those orphans who do not remember the disaster their parents suffered. Send away all the rest with the caravan." To further illustrate the deliberate planning that the Young Turks had undertaken regarding the deportations, when Morgenthau asked Talat during one meeting to relent regarding the Armenians, consider the material loss, and what would become of Turkey without them, he recorded Talat's response as follows. "We care nothing about the commercial loss," replied Talat. "We have figured all that out, and we know that it will not exceed £5 million. We don't worry about that. I have asked you to come here so as to let you know that our Armenian policy is absolutely fixed and that nothing can change it. We will not have the Armenians anywhere in Anatolia. They can live in the desert, but nowhere else." Finally, German missionary Dr. Martin Niepich made the following observation regarding the intent of the deportations. The object of the deportations is the extermination of the whole Armenian nation. This purpose is also proved by the fact that the Turkish government declines all assistance from missionaries, Sisters of Mercy, and European residents in the country, and systematically tries to stop their work. A Swiss engineer was to have been brought before a court-martial because he had distributed bread in Anatolia to the starving Armenian women and children in a convoy of exiles. The mass killings of the deportation convoys that started in April 1915 seem to have abated somewhat by August. At least it was at that time that the reports of the starving Armenians became prominent in the West. The potential survivability of the Armenians as a nation was by then considered negligible, that they did not have to be killed outright. Armenians kept being moved so that they could not make up more than 10% of the local population. This entailed long, continuous forced marches from place to place, during which most of those who had survived to that point died of starvation, thirst, exposure, and disease. Children and young women who survived to reach the desert were absorbed into Muslim homes. Why was starvation employed as one of the methods of genocide when direct killing produced such effective results and much more quickly? Why devote considerable numbers of military age and trained men to lead and guard deportation caravans for weeks and months. Henry Theriault has argued that dehumanization is generally considered a given as a factor in genocide. But in the Armenian genocide, he says, quote, it is clear that the perpetrators at every level not only recognized the humanity of their victims, but in fact killed Armenians precisely because of their fully human, not subhuman status. The answer may be found in the way the Armenians were killed. Theriault characterizes the brutality perpetrated against the Armenians as, quote, festivals of cruelty that involved rape and other forms of torture. The treatment of deportation caravans maximized cruelty for direct victims of given acts, as well as for other Armenians present, causing intense emotional anguish, and in front of all caravan members, heightening fear and traumatizing them through the witnessing of such brutal suffering and death. End of quote. According to one report, the Armenians themselves said they would by far have preferred to be massacred. Morgenthau described the discussion he had with a government official about the tortures being inflicted on the Armenians. He made no secret of the fact that the government had instigated them, and, like all Turks of the official classes, he enthusiastically approved this treatment of the detested race. This official told me that all these details were matters of nightly discussion at the headquarters of the Union and Progress Committee. Each new method of inflicting pain was hailed as a splendid discovery, and the regular attendants were constantly ransacking their brains in the effort to devise some new torment. He told me that they even delved into the records of the Spanish Inquisition and other historic institutions of torture and adopted all the suggestions found there. This admission explains the grotesque atrocities described in numerous eyewitness accounts by survivors, missionaries, and foreign officials, which I have not talked about at all. The perpetrators sought not merely to kill the Armenians, but strived to maximize their suffering. This death through torment, as Theriault called it, quote, is possible precisely because of the human status of the victims. He argued, citing Friedrich Nietzsche, that the pleasure derived from the suffering of others is an expression of the perpetrator's power over their victims. It is well documented that rape, for example, a common feature in genocide and certainly prevalent in the Armenian genocide, is not so much an act of sexual gratification as an act of violent domination. Certainly in the years leading up to the Armenian genocide, there were many expressions of envy, resentment, and calls to violence by extreme Turkish nationalists against the Christians for not staying in their proper subordinate position. Starvation was deliberately used by the Young Turks as one of the methods of killing during the Armenian genocide, with the intention of dominating the Armenians by inflicting extreme suffering and punishment, leading to a slow, agonizing death. Thank you.
And Professor Apko will respond. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I think I'll just make some comments. It's difficult to respond after what George just read. First, I want to thank both the Holodomor Consortium, and in particular Marta, and as well the Zorian Institute for putting this together and for inviting me. The Plague by Albert Camus has, toward its conclusion, Dr. Roux writing at the end that he is the person who has indeed been the chronicler all along. He's resolved to compile this chronicle so that he should not be one of those who hold their peace, but should bear witness in favor of those plague-stricken people, so that some memorial of the injustice and outrage done them might endure. And again, I thank the sponsors. I think we're here today in that tradition to try to chronicle, witness, and evaluate. This morning's session, two different cases of how the right to food was denied, and the withdrawal of food, and the capacity to produce and ingest it, and how this resulted in disease, malnutrition, suffering, dehumanization for some, and physical death. And so in the two cases that we have this morning, and again, one of the things we're very aware of, I think, is as the sources open in the former Soviet Union, as the Chinese famine is increasingly written about, that withdrawal of food is a weapon, a strategy, a design in which populations are eviscerated, diminished, targeted, and that this has been an ongoing process throughout history. Part of what the two cases also see as they've been presented is that one, the case of the Armenian genocide, as George Sherinian argued, is genocide. It certainly fits under the UN Genocide Convention and is clearly acts committed with intent to destroy in whole and part. On the other hand, Professor McGowan argues that in fact genocide convention doesn't fit, and in particular that famous clause within the convention, and I will quote it, not only direct killing, but also acts, quote, causing seriously bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So part of what, there are many different levels in which the two papers we heard this morning and the two papers we'll hear this afternoon discuss the use of starvation. And one of the things one of the issues here is whether the Genocide Convention fits. And again, I would argue that one of the points in Professor McGowan's discussion is that he doesn't really talk about agency in terms of what government responsibility was and what its intention was. And his analysis talks about something very, very important in highlighting the many players who have different degrees of responsibility. So one of my sort of points that I would like to ask Professor McGowan is that because the process of destruction, whether we call it genocide or not, is so multi-layered and so complicated, are there not different levels of responsibility of different actors? And isn't that important, in fact, in evaluating how we are going to how we're going to assign responsibility for the Irish famine? So, in brief, what I'm saying is, if, in fact, as many scholars purport, the Irish famine was a genocide, if there was an intentionality of manipulation of a natural event which was made much worse, were there some actors who are to be held more responsible than others? Historiography is something that we see debated, and Professor McGowan's talk very much traced some of the Irish historiography This morning I'm very pleased to see there are a number of students here, and hopefully those students will rewrite once again these histories. They're being rewritten right now. And the question of intentionality is one that's extremely important, certainly, in the lens not only of genocide studies, but of human atrocity in general. Was the starvation the result of intentional policies in Ireland, and and who holds responsibility for those? The second sort of piece that I wanted to point out of Professor McGowan's discussion was related to the range of ways in which the Irish famine affected the Irish community. And again, that certainly is also true for every community, the Armenian community, in the cases that we'll see this afternoon. And in his discussion, this is, I think, an important piece. We're right now in the middle of an immigration crisis, a migration crisis. And when we think about the Irish famine and 1 million people killed who died, I think and 1.5 million who migrated. What did that mean in terms of the society and the culture? There is so much now being written about the push and pull factors that contribute to what happens when societies not only undergo atrocities, but also when they are forced to be displaced or to emigrate. What does that do to the family? What does that do to the culture? What does that do to society? And again, hunger can be the tool that further pushes further evisceration of peoples. Professor Sherinian's talk on the Armenian genocide gives us a sense of the intentionality of the way in which starvation was one of a number of tools used in the destructive process. And it points out through testimony over and over again that this was not, that it might indeed have been easier just to shoot people out, but that in fact destroying them through withdrawal of food, which again is a pattern used throughout genocide and other intentional atrocities throughout history. So the withdrawal of food means also great suffering. What's the impact of this on communities? And we're here for a conference on starvation, in which we see that we haven't yet spoken about what's the impact of starvation on the aftermath. Again, I see these processes as not stopping at their height, but continuing afterward, from stunted growth to malnutrition to physical and mental disabilities that go on in populations long after the end of the height of starvation, and as part of the displacement and intentional harm physically as well mentally done to populations. Another piece of, I think, Professor Sherinian's talk that's very important is that he raises the issue that Henry Thoreau raised about how, why is suffering maximalized in so many cases of in the Armenian genocide, and looks at the issue of dehumanization and leaves us with this very important question of whether or not heightened dehumanization, in fact, was something the perpetrators sought to do, and whether or not the moral question we have to ask of victims who are further dehumanized, is it any worse? How can we morally speak about the difference between a person who was starved to death and diminished and dehumanized, as opposed to someone who was killed outright. So there are different levels in which the starvation in the Armenian genocide in this paper is spoken about as a way in which to further dehumanize on forced marches, deportation convoys of carrying out and what these crimes and what is the impact afterward on populations that survive. Both of these papers again are looking at the way in which starvation is used in different contexts and seen. But Professor McGowan sees this more as part of human history and historical circumstances, again pointing out that there are many people who are responsible and many factors, and that the popular notion that this is part of an intentional process has to be put aside, and instead the many factors need to be looked at. And I would also ask as a third question to Professor McGowan whether or not there is not a value for the people who are survivors, great-great-grandchildren, for how they want to remember these events. For Professor Sherinian, I wanted to just also ask if he thought that the impact of starvation on those in the Death March, how, if he has testimony on other people who either took part in or who later helped in terms of the damages that this inflicted physically and mentally on people. So in conclusion, again, these are two very different takes, really, on two terrible historical events. I would claim the impacts of these events still go on. They continue to go on and have impact in the social and cultural worlds of the communities who live on and who remember them, as well as in history more generally, and that the use of food as a weapon points out so well to us that in the age of modernity, the popular notions of needing to build sophisticated places, killing centers, or sophisticated weapons is indeed not necessary. That as we see both in the Irish famine, the Armenian genocide, we will see this afternoon in the Ukrainian case, and in the Nuba Mountains right now, that the withdrawal of the right to food, an international norm, that governments have a responsibility to carry out for their citizens, continues to be used quite effectively as a weapon of destruction. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Professor Apsel and both of our speakers for their presentations. And I think with the permission of our organizers, shall we give our two speakers just a brief chance to respond to some of Professor Apsel's particular questions while we let the members of the audience formulate their own questions. Then we'll gather a few questions, and I think we're going to end the session around 12:15, right? Okay, so Professor McGowan, would you like to give a little response?
There we are. I'm going to be very brief. I'll respond to all three, and I think good question. In a presentation that is limited by time, you really can't talk about the integral relationship between all of those factors that I presented, and then get into an understanding first about the system that's actually in place, that's sustained by several levels of civil society and by government. And these are all interlocking. So, for example, the landlords are also part of the British government. I mean, Lord Gregory is also a Galway landlord, but he's also one of the architects of the Gregory Clause. So, I mean, the government, what is the government? The government is not only integral to and critical of the landlord, many of the landlords, but also in terms of their political economy, are also being supported by merchants, large farmers, and the like. So it's very hard, and I think artificially, for presentation's sake, I've separated them, but it's a collective responsibility by people who are working together, including the church. For example, the Catholic Church in Ireland at the time is worried about the payments made by the British government to Maynooth, its seminary, which is supported, ironically, by the British government. And there are pushes and pulls and conflicts within the church itself. So what level of government responsibility? We're talking about early, mid-19th century, when governments in the British Empire didn't even see themselves as being responsible for public education, okay? So the levels of what a government was expected to do in the early to mid-19th century is certainly different from what we've come to expect in our own time, or even 50 years after the Irish famine. In terms of the 2.5, and in no way, shape, or form in my presentation should anyone read that I do not consider this a huge human tragedy by any stretch of the imagination. This was a horrific loss of life, but I think the historiography has been remiss in looking at one of the key factors to play, and that is the political economy of the time and the impacts of laissez-faire capitalism that was allowed to essentially sit there. Now, in terms of the missing, the 2.5 million, it does have an impact. I mean, there's a whole diasporic story. In fact, I'm not an expert on Ireland particularly. My expertise is more on the diaspora itself. What happens to them after the fact? But you have to know the transatlantic story. So, for example, in the United States, famine migrants who essentially migrate to the United States in greater numbers than to British North America after 1847 have a massive impact both on the American labor market, on American politics, and also on the consciousness of what it means to be Irish, and fueling a very distinctive Irish-American nationalism that will actually have an effect on supporting Irish nationalism at critical times within its history, including right up until the Troubles in the 1970s. In terms of at least one impact was the Catholic Church's view of this as being providential. Archbishop Lynch here in Toronto in the 1870s likened this process in Irish history as the hand of God in spreading Irish Catholicism throughout the British Empire to make an impact in the English-speaking world for the sake of what he said was the true faith. And actually there's not been all that much exploration of providentialism on the Catholic side. And finally, on the survivors, and I say this because I have been the historical consultant to Ireland Park here in Toronto, the famine commemoration. And actually, I've just finished a large study of famine memory. And in fact, one of the things you learn, how instructive it is that there are many things going on in a commemoration site. First of all, there's the events that actually are being commemorated, and then the ideas of those events by those who commemorate. And in fact, when you look at a memorial like Ireland Park, it says as much about those who built the monument and how they choose to remember than the actual event itself. And there is an ongoing dialogue between those who build the memorial and the historiography of the event itself, which is one of the reasons why I think it's important to study memorials in a much bigger way than what we've done. Emily Mark Fitzgerald has written a brilliant book recently on famine commemoration in Australia, the United States, Canada, Ireland, and the UK. Very interesting book in the way in which memorials are used or misused. The one memorial shot that I showed you there in talking about providentialism was actually in Northern Ireland at Warren Point, which was a departure point. And it was one that Emily Mark Fitzgerald didn't even know about. She works in Dublin, but this was a Northern Ireland commemoration to the famine, which is why I put it up there.
Regarding the non-Armenian witnesses to the genocide, I can think of two worth mentioning for their response. One was American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau. If you read his memoir, he was deeply outraged by the behavior of the Young Turk leadership. When he left office as ambassador, he devoted his life, at least for the next several years, to Near East relief, raising or helping to raise millions of dollars to feed the starving Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians. The case of Armin T. Wegner is also worth mentioning. The German sanitation officer who was forbidden to take those pictures, he took a lot of photographs which were destroyed by his superiors, but he smuggled those few we saw out under his belt. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power, Armin T. Wegner, who was aware of the policies of intolerance applied against the Armenians in 1915, wrote a letter to Adolf Hitler complaining of the Nazi ideology, for which he was arrested and sent to jail for several years. In the case of the Armenian survivors, there have been psychological studies of the effects, and certainly the trauma of what they endured is very profound, and they feel a need that they can't avoid to share the story, and especially to help the next generation understand what they went through. And the other factor to mention is they're very troubled by the denial of what happened by the Turkish state to this day.
So let's maybe gather a couple of questions to maximize the chance for people to comment. And can I just ask you, when you ask your question, maybe stand up so everyone can hear and just say your name. So we'll take about 3 questions, and then we'll let our speakers respond to all together.
I can't really...
Oh, sorry, can I ask you to identify yourself for them?
I'm sorry. My name's Harry Armstrong. I'm a student here in history at U of T and also at Glendon College. So, is this on? Okay. I can't really make any comments about this. I mean, it's just a tour de force. But I will say one thing. I live here in this country. This is my country, Canada. The federal government in this country has a special relationship with the territories, Northwest Territories, Yukon, Nunavut. Has a special relationship with Aboriginal peoples. In the last 10 years, nothing has been done about the problem of water on Aboriginal reserves. Nothing has been done about the northern food policy. We've had a Whig government for the last 10 years in this country.
Sorry, we just going to say it's very important, but please very short.
I'm going to make it short. So the question is this. We've replaced one majority government with another. What are we going to do about this? These questions about food policy in Canada, the water question on Aboriginal reserves, and northern food policy. You can all go out tomorrow, buy a 2-pound bag of carrots for $2. Up north, it costs you $25.
Okay, thank you. Let's take these 2 questions, Sam and Bogdan, and then we'll let them answer. We'll come back for the next round.
Voice. Sam Totten from the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville in the United States. I want to thank you, Professor McGowan, for your succinct but fascinating overview of the Irish famine. My question is, to date, have other scholars taken into consideration 2 of the key points that you made? And what I mean is those individuals who claim or assert that that case is genocide, a case of genocide, have they taken into consideration the economic issues that you raised and the multifaceted responsibility of the various actors at that time, or have they ignored that?
And then if you just pass the microphone behind you.
My name is Bogdan Kleed, University of Alberta, and I have two questions, one to Professor Shirinyan, and that is the maximization of suffering. In the Ukrainian case, certainly one can make an argument that it was the maximization of suffering could be a means of teaching the peasants a lesson, or teaching peasants a lesson. Could that also apply to the Armenian case? That's the question. And the question to Professor McGowan is the following. You mentioned that the state, our expectations for the state, I think, is much greater, or perhaps more wide-ranging than the expectations or the of what a state should be obligated to do back in the mid-19th century. Of course, this is a modern sort of conception, but Britain was one of the most modern states of that time. And when we look at the question of genocide here, we also, and intentionality, I think we can certainly make the case, as Professor Apsel has argued, that the Armenian case is pretty cut and dry. The Irish case, we have a case where we're not looking at a state policy that causes starvation, but a state policy that's reacting to a case of starvation. And here, just as in, I think, in the case of where states actually cause starvation, we can look at various levels or grades of responsibility. And, but I'd like to, I guess, end by saying that when we look at responsibility, I think even back in the mid-19th century, the state is first and foremost was responsible for the welfare of its population. Individuals and organizations can be given some should be given some responsibility, but on a very secondary and tertiary level, I think the state is really where we have to focus our attention.
Okay, so three very interesting sets of issues, and any of the three of you.
To the question if the Armenian genocide was meant to be more punitive, I would have to say no. The intention was eradication of the Armenians. When you look at the methods that were used, the statements of intent, and the results, it seems pretty clear. The statement that I read from Dr. Martin Nepich, my closing eyewitness statement, I ended it early. He went on to also mention the American government offered to take the Armenians away on ships to the United States, and the Ottoman government refused.
So the two questions, and I'll handle the one on how do the populists deal with a multifaceted, analysis of responsibility. And it depends on who you read, but let's just take Tim Pat Coogan, for example, since his is the most recent. Now he tries to offer the sweep, but the problem is that the evidence that he uses is highly selective in each one. So for example, when you read about the landlords, it's heavily weighted to, the landlords like, Lord Lucan and others that I mentioned, and there really is no in-depth analysis of those landlords like De Vere and Hamilton and others that did what they did on behalf of the people. The other thing too is that one of the more contentious areas is the church. Okay, so one of the slogans that comes out of the famine is no priest died of hunger during the famine. Well, a lot of priests died, but they died of fever and other related diseases. There's a legion of stories if you go through ecclesiastical archives to show how they suffered along with their people. In fact, many of the priests came from a middling farmer class, so they had their own allegiances within society. Even the most, for example, the most recent analysis that focuses solely on the church avoids the whole question of church building, church decoration, papal collections, and the like. So, there's a selectivity of evidence. On the second question, which I think is also a really important question, is on the role of the state. Certainly, the state does have an overarching responsibility, and I'm fairly clear that this was a state that was not terribly creative because of the way it was hemmed in by its political economy, ideology. This was a state that was not terribly nimble, that was resistant to some of the things that were suggested to it by members of parliament and by other landlords, and that is, for example, migration was potentially one of the things that could have released some of the social pressures within Ireland. But the British government at the time felt that that was far more expensive than actually doing what it was doing. In fact, they had two cases to go on, the 1823 and 1825 migrations to British North America by Peter Robinson, from which we get most of our Irish Canadians in the Peterborough area and parts of the Upper Ottawa Valley. They were extraordinarily expensive. So the state moved out of sponsoring migration. But if you even want to compare it to a contemporary state, and I think it's one of the most effective ways of pointing out the shortcomings of the British government in this case, is to take a look at Nova Scotia. Much smaller story, but I mean, relative scale, you have the easternmost part of the province in crisis with the same problem, and that is poor farmers who are starving because their potato crop has failed in 1844, 1845, 1846. Now, what does the Nova Scotia government do? They're not hemmed in by that ideology. They're actually a Tory administration, and what they do is they do two things. First of all, they supply food as quickly as possible to Cape Breton, and secondly, they supply tools and seed for the diversification of farming in places like the Margaree Valley and along the shores of the Bredor Lakes. It's also interesting that a cultural factor plays in. It was not only Irish who were starving in Cape Breton, but there were Scots and Mi'kmaq First Nations peoples and English settlers who are also, and Acadians. So, but the Nova Scotia government showed that actually something could be done very quickly if you're not ideologically hidebound. Just another case.
I saw 3 questions here, the gentleman here, and Frank, and Greg. So shall we take those 3? Actually, I have something to say to you too, but later.
Thank you. My name is Yuri Darevich. I'm not an expert on any of these topics. I have a question for Professor McGowan. Firstly, could you explain a bit how the potato monoculture came to be? Were there nothing else, like not even poultry or farm animals, no other crops? The second is, what fraction of the population actually perished? I don't know what the population of Ireland at the time was. Then the landowners, landlords, who were they? Were they local Irish people? And what was their attitude towards the people that suffered in general? I mean, you did point out that some of them helped, etc. And lastly, what effect did the famine have ultimately on the Irish desire for an independent statehood? Then I have a couple of questions for... Okay, well, you don't have to...
David and I teach a course on this.
As far as the Armenians, I nevertheless would like to ask this question. Where were these deportees intended to go? Like, presumably they all came from one area where the Armenians were a majority initially. And secondly, you referred to the Young Turks as being sort of the people responsible for carrying through this policy. Could you comment also on what, was there a central government with the Sultan in charge, or was they no longer in existence? And who were these Young Turks? What was their ideology, if you like? Lastly, what fraction of the Armenian population died, and is there still an Armenian minority in Turkey?
Right. So that's 2 courses worth, but I'll give it to you.
Hi, my name's Ronald. I have a question for Professor McGowan. So you talked about these different parties of responsibility, and you seem to emphasize what they're not doing. You know, there's a non-interventionist policy, the laissez-faire policy. The church did not change their way of tithing. People did not want to change their way. So this seems to be an atrocity of non-intervention and not doing something. Is this different in the popular and political imagination and perception of an atrocity that happens because of something that people did not do versus an atrocity that is done? You know, obviously the obvious example is the concentration camps. You know, they set up the camps in order to exterminate people and to starve people.
Oh, my own question. Okay. Yes, and then I'll pass on to Greg. So just one thing on the potato famine. Western Ukraine is also hit by a potato famine at this point in time. Interestingly enough, there were two major differences. One, it wasn't an island. So people fled across the Carpathians into Bukovina and into other regions. But two, there was serfdom. That is, it was in the landlord's interest that peasants survived because they were an economic good that the landlord controlled. Although, in fact, some of the potato regions are the mountains where the serfdom is not as strong. So I'm just wondering on that. It's tied with the second, and that's to both of you question. What's being suppressed is the human custom deep in traditional societies to give nutrition, nurture, and hospitality to someone else. You've got to suppress that, that instinct, that social convention that was quite deep. I would argue in some areas where this more traditional landlord-serf relationship was, you might have been better off because the landlords had not given up that as a custom. That is, in some ways, whether we call it laissez-faire capitalism or whatever, but this ability to think in new ways suppresses that. Or in the case of the Armenians and the Turks, you have this very hospitable Muslim culture now because of religious and whatever regions now being turned against it. Although we got indications that it's not always so easy to do, that even the Ottoman authorities had to come out with punishments for people who would revert to it. But I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. That is, the decline of the traditional hospitality cultures and how those conventions and instincts are suppressed.
And then please just pass the microphone to Greg, and that will be the last question of this set. I've got to give them a time to answer.
My name is Greg Sarkisian. I'm the president of Zorian Institute. I have a question to Mr. McGowan. It's a two-part question. The first one is, this potato crop problem did occur any place else in United Kingdom, like Wales or England itself or Scotland? And did the government have, did the government have a different policy in those regions, or they applied the same laissez-faire economy and intervention or non-intervention by the government? The second question is, since you're an expert in diaspora, so I'd like to know, how do you find that the diasporan, Irish diaspora, react to this issue, whether it's in the United States, Canada, or elsewhere? Thanks.
So again, same thing.
In answer to the question, where were the Armenians deported from? They were deported from all corners of the Ottoman Empire and in the direction of the Syrian desert. When I mentioned the name of Deir Zor, that is the main city in the desert. And if you remember, I mentioned the quote that Morgenthau quoted from Talat saying, they will live nowhere but in the desert. You asked, who are the Young Turks? So there are books written about this, but in a nutshell, they were a group of Turkish nationalists who were witnessing the dissolution of the glorious Ottoman Empire from the start of the 19th century, as group by group broke off and achieved their independence. And they wanted to stop that and preserve the integrity of the empire. And World War I seems to have given them the opportunity. They had no logical reason to enter that war, but they chose to do so because they thought they had a chance to win and keep Russia at bay. Russia was seen as the main enemy in fomenting Armenians, Kurds, Assyrians, and other groups into dividing up the Ottoman Empire. Their ideology was not religious, although they certainly used religion to motivate the masses. They're very cynical political operators. They were known as the Young Turks because the Committee of Union and Progress was actually a coalition of different parties, but in January of 1913, the Young Turk faction basically seized the government and became the dictatorship. Some of the names I've mentioned, Talat, Cemal, and Enver Pashas. In answer to Frank's question about the laws of hospitality, I can mention that there's a recurrent theme among the Turks and Arabs and Kurds who rescued Armenians, that the killing of this protected group was against Islam. And by extension, I might say that it broke the rules of hospitality.
Okay, this is going to be like the litany of the saints here, going through all of the questions. I've stirred the pot. In terms of the potato monoculture, yeah, they were growing other crops in Ireland. And maybe I'll answer the questions that you pose collectively. When this system is imposed on Ireland by the British conquerors, the land is divided up mostly between English and Scottish Protestant landlords. Over time, they weren't exclusively Protestant. Most of the tenants, particularly in the southern counties, were Roman Catholic. In the north, it was a mixture. The way in which these landed estates behave, for example, is different in different parts of Ireland. So, for example, a tenant who paid rents in the south was not necessarily acknowledged as or compensated for having made improvements on the land, whereas in some estates in the north, this was the case. So the system worked a little bit differently. What happens is that because of a variety of actions placed upon Catholics in Ireland from, well, beginning really in the 16th century, but certainly more forcefully in the late 17th century, that is the lack of mobility into public office, the lack of voting, the inability to own land outright, a whole series of test acts and penal laws designed to suppress and eventually assimilate the Catholic population and basically fail. And in the 18th century, it's a nudge, wink situation in Ireland. In fact, Catholics are eventually emancipated politically in 1829 through the agencies of Daniel O'Connell and forging alliances with British politicians at Westminster. Who were the landlords? Many of them, by the time of the famine, referred to themselves as Anglo-Irish or Irish. They were born. They were several generations in Ireland. Jolly, for example, that rather eccentric individual, considered himself very Irish, even though his background was French. And as a French Huguenot, had inherited a estate, but considered himself very Irish, and that was interested in the Irish culture, music, and that's probably why it's reflected in the drawings within his diary. You had many absentee landlords that lived in other parts of the United Kingdom. Their lands were essentially managed by agents who sometimes really were some of the most hateful people on the ground in Ireland in terms of the way they meted out rental payments and the like. How does the famine play out in Irish history? That's a huge question, because there's the psychological school that said the survivors didn't want to talk about it. There was a collective survivor guilt. I mean, these are all highly debated points in Irish historiography right now. Certainly, as Irish nationalism built in the 19th century and came to fruition almost 100 years ago next year in the Rising, the famine would become one of those touchstone motifs that could be used. There's an interesting sculpture, and I'll use that as a case study, outside of Ballyseedy near Tralee in County Kerry, and it was erected to commemorate the Irish Civil War and the victory of the Irish Republican Army eventually. It was unveiled in the 1950s, and there is an emaciated body from which a baby is taken by a young woman, given to a man who's got his shirt sleeve rolled up, marching into Ireland's new future. And even though the sculptor was a Breton, he certainly understood that Ireland's past, and certainly this emaciated figure, it was quite, quite a strong and powerful image of the famine, and from this we've moved here. So it does play in Irish history, and I think that's one of the reasons too why it becomes such one of the hot button issues when Irish scholars and popular journalists and others get together. Problem of something done and not done, and I think if I had more time, I mean, there are sins of omission and sins of commission, Ronald, and I've really railed on the British government for actually the things that they did do were ineffective, right from the implementation of a poor law that didn't fit to types of outdoor relief that didn't work and public work systems that didn't work. In terms of hospitality culture, I always find it interesting reading the letters of priests who, writing back mostly to Bishop Murray in Dublin, describing the horror that they see all around them. I was eating supper last night and there were people at my door, begging for food. Although in all of these letters, I've never seen a priest say that he got up from his table, opened the door, and then shared his meal. And that's it, or that he gave up his food. But we know that this happened. So in terms of the hospitality culture, I think this is where we have to look at a much broader picture than just the government as to how the famine is lived on the ground by a variety of the people I talked about. In terms of famine in other parts of the UK, certainly there was a potato failure in Scotland. It certainly wasn't as large a challenge to the British government as the one in Ireland. And actually an argument has been made by Peter Gray, who I think is one of the foremost of the famine scholars, in that had the famine itself taken place on this scale in England, okay, that the British government may have responded with far greater effectiveness than they did in Ireland. And that raises all kinds of issues with regard to English attitudes towards the Irish historically. And I don't have enough time, I barely have enough time to address these questions to get on that. In terms of how does the Irish diaspora respond? Christine Keneally has written an excellent book, published about 3 or 4 years ago, on the international efforts raising money for the famine. Here I'll make my link to George's paper, because actually the Sultan in Constantinople offered £5,000, which was a pretty hefty sum for famine relief in 1847, but the British government said he couldn't offer that much because Queen Victoria had offered 2,000, and it wouldn't look good that she was being usurped because she was the queen by a foreign monarch. And so donations came from Irish people around the world who were already, and in fact Canada had, its population was primarily pre-famine here, and so collections were made across British North America, in the United States as well. The Choctaw Nation, First Nation, in the southern United States donated $75, which was a fairly princely sum. And it's interesting because the chief of the Choctaws frequently shows up at Irish famine commemorations, so that the contribution of his nation is not forgotten.
It's perhaps strange that we signal the end of our session on starvation by announcing the arrival of lunch, but indeed, lunch is here. Let's take the opportunity to thank our speakers, all of you.